They say the earth never forgets a debt. 12 years ago, our elders buried a secret in the dark of the forest. Tonight, that secret just crawled back into the village, wearing the skin of a newborn child. They waited for the baby to cry, but he only smiled. By the time the sun rose, 3 elders were cold in their beds, and the village realized that whatever Ifeoma had betted, it had not come from the land of the living. The air inside the birth hut was thick enough to shock a grown man, smelling of iron, salt, and something ancient that had no business being in a room of the living. Outside, the cricket had suddenly gone silent, as if even the insect knew that the natural order had been violated. Ifeoma lay on the sweat-soaked mat, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gaps that mirrored the flickering oil lamp against the mud wall. For 3 days and 3 nights, the labor had clung at her inside, a relentless storm that seemed determined to break her bone by bone before it bettered her. She had been barren for 10 long years, 10 years of being the woman whose womb was whispered to be a graveyard, a dry well in a land of fertile spring. When this seed finally took roots, she had gathered it with a ferocity that bordered on madness. The village had watched her belly grow with a mixture of pity and suspicion. But Ifeoma only cared about the life kicking against her rib, the tiny pulse that promised to redeem her from the shame of an empty house. When the final push came, it wasn't a scream that filled the room, but a heavy, unnatural weight that seems to suck the oxygen from the air. The midwife, a woman named Olushi, whose hand had caught 1,000 souls entering this world, reached down to receive the child. She was prepared for the wet slap of skin, the frantic struggle of hair, and the piercing melodic cry that signifies the lungs have tasted the world. But as she put the boy into the dim light of the hut, Olushi froze. Her breath hitched in her throat. There was no will. There was no gasping struggle. The infant sleepily opened his eyes, wide, dark, and impossibly ancient, and stared directly into the midwife's soul. He did not look like a newborn. He looked like a judge who had been waiting for his court to be called to order. Olushi's hands trembled so violently that the child almost slipped from her grip. She looked for the usual sign of life, the heavy chest, the mottled skin of a struggling heart. But the boy was as still as a statue carved from the obsidian. He didn't blink. He looked at the thatched roof, then at the shadows dancing in the corner, and then finally at his mother. And then his tiny blood-smeared lip curled into a slow, deliberate smile. That was the exact moment the first elder died. Across the village, in a hut guided by powerful shams and the status of 90 winters, the oldest man in the community, Mazi Okoro, gasped once and grew cold. He didn't die of a cough, a failing heart, or a slow rot of age. He died as if the very breath had been sucked out of him by a vacuum he couldn't see. His eyes fixed on a ceiling that suddenly held no protection. By the time the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the dust of the village square in shades of bruised purple and angry orange, 2 more elders had been found dead in their beds. They were discovered with their eyes wide open, their face twisted into masks of absolute soul-crushing terror. It was as if they had seen someone they had buried long ago walking back through their front door, uninvited and unforgiven. The village, usually a place of mourning, shattered, and a rhythmic thumping of mortars, fell into a suffocating hush. The news moved like a cold draft through the hut. A child was born. The child did not cry. 3 pillars of the community had fallen. Ifeoma held the child to her breast, her heart breaking with a love that was already being poisoned by fear. She saw the way he watched the door, his head tilting slightly as if listening to conversation miles away. He wasn't looking for milk. He was waiting for visitors. She named him Shede. God exists. But when she whispered the name, it felt like a heavy stone on her tongue. The midwife had fled the hut without a word, leaving the umbilical cord barely tied, her eyes wide with a terror that no herb could cure. Ifeoma was alone with her miracle, a miracle that felt increasingly like a curse. In our land, the spiritual system is as rigid as the law of gravity. Every child must cry to announce its soul's arrival. The first cry is a formal declaration. It is the soul way of saying, I am here. I have left the realm of the spirits, and I claim my place among the living. If the cry is absent, the door remains open. The child is not a person but a vessel, a suit of skin worn by something that crawled out of the red earth to settle a depth. Such a child is believed to feed on the unspoken, the things hidden in the dark, the secrets that people think they have taken to their grave. And this child, with his unsettling smile and silent lungs, was clearly hungry. As the second night fell, the silence of the child began to exert a physical pressure on the village. People who walked past Ifeoma's hut reported hearing a low humming sound, like 1,000 bees vibrating behind the mud wall. Though Ifeoma heard nothing but the rhythmic, quiet breathing of the boy. The first sign that the boy was not just an omen but an active force came during the wake for the three elders. A man named Ekweme, a respected orator and a man whose word was law in the marketplace, stood up to deliver a eulogy. He was a man of immense pride, known for his clean robes and his even cleaner reputation. He had come to Ifeoma's home earlier that day, ostensibly to offer a blessing, but in reality, he had come to stare into the eyes of the silent one, to prove he was not afraid. But as he stood before the village to speak of the dead elders, his tongue suddenly thickened into his mouth. His eyes glazed over, turning a milky white, in a voice that sounded like grinding stone. He began to speak. He didn't offer a prayer. Instead, he confessed to poisoning his own brother 15 years ago over a land dispute. The village went cold. The man's wife, who had stood proudly by his side, let out a shriek that pierced the night, but Ekweme couldn't stop. The word poured out of him like bile, every details of the plot, the name of the poison, the way his brother had looked at him as if he died, pleading for help while Ekweme watched the life fade. The moment the final word left his lip, Ekweme's heart simply stopped beating. He fell forward into the dust, dead before his head hit the ground. A collective gasp went up from the villagers. They looked towards Ifeoma's hut, where a single oil lamp burnt. They knew now that the child was not just washing, he was digging. Fear turned into frantic, clawing thing. The village began to empty as family packed their belongings into woven baskets and fled into the bush, terrifying that the silent boy would look at them next. They knew they all carried shadows. They knew that in the privacy of the dark, they had all done things that the sun should never seen. The marketplace stood empty. The goat wandered the path unattended. Ifeoma remained, a prisoner of her own devotion, and the growing realization of her son was the center of vortex. She watched Shady grow at impossible rates. In a week, he had the coordination of a 6-month-old. His movements were too fluid, his gaze too focused. He never whimpered in the night. He only watched the shadow in the corners of the room as if they were old friends coming home to roast. One evening, a blind woman named Nneka, the oldest soul left in the village, crossed to Ifoma's door. Nneka had lost her sight decade ago, but people said she saw the world in colors of energy and spirit. She didn't need eyes to see the darkness pulling around the hut like spilled ink. She sat on the dirt floor, her sightless eyes fixed on the corner where the baby lay in his basket. She told Ifoma that the child wasn't killing them. He was collecting what they had buried. She warned that the boy was tied to a specific sin, a knot in the fabric of the village's history that had never been untied. If the truth wasn't revealed, the child would continue to feed on the guilt of the living until there was no one left but Ifoma. And then he would take her too, as a final payment for the silence she had helped maintain. Ifoma felt a cold shiver trace the lines of her spine. She looked at her son. She was staring at Nneka with a look of recognition, as if they were two travelers meeting on a lonely road. Ifoma's mind raced back through the years, searching for the source of this haunting. She was a woman of the village, a daughter of the soil, and she knew its history as well as she knew the lines on her own palms. She began to think of the great famine that had struck 12 years ago, a time so lean that a dog ate their own tail and the clouds turned to dust. The crops had withered, and the ribs of children had begun to poke through their skin like the bars of a cage. She remembered the secret meeting of the elders, the hushed conversation behind closed doors, while the rest of the village prayed to gods who seemed to have turned their back. Desperation makes monsters of men, and Ifoma began to wonder just how deep that monstrosity had gone. She began to investigate the deaths of the elders, creeping into their abandoned huts while the village hid in fear. In the house of Mazi Okoro, she found a small rusted blade tucked beneath a floorboard, wrapped in a cloth stained with old brown blood. In the house of the second elder, she found a necklace of glass beads that had belonged to a newborn, beads that were not of their village. The memories began to click into places like teeth biting down on a tongue. She remembered a night in the forest, a night without a moon, when the elders had decided that the gods required a life to unlock the rain. They had taken a child born to a stranger, a woman who had wandered into the village seeking refuge and had died in childbirth. The baby had no one to mourn it, no one to protect it. They had sacrificed it in the deep woods, believing their cruelty would buy them survival. Ifoma had been there. She hadn't held the knife, but she had held the torch. She had watched the small flame flickered out in the dark, and she had said nothing when the rain finally fell the next morning. She had eaten the grain that grew from that blood-soaked soil. She had survived on the silence of a murdered infant. The realization hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. The child in her arm was not just her son. He was a return of the stolen life. He was the innocent they had discarded, reborn through the very woman who had watched him die. He wasn't here for revenge in the way a human understands it. He was here for balance. The spirit of the sacrificed infant had been wandering the forest unburied and unacknowledged, and it has used Ifoma's long empty womb as a doorway back into the world of men. But the village was not ready to confess. Led by a warrior named Obinna, a man who feared nothing he could see with his eyes, a small group of men decided to take matters into their own hands. They believed that if the child was the source of the curse, then destroying the child would break the spell. They arrived at Ifoma's hut in the dead of the night, their faces painted with white chalks, their machetes gleaming in the moonlight. Obinna kicked open the door, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and resolve. He reached for the basket where Shady lay, but before his hand could touch the child's skin, he froze. His body began to jerk as if he were being electrocuted. His mouth opened, and instead of a war cry, out came the confession of how he had stolen his neighbor's livestock during the famine and watched that neighbor's children starve to death. One by one, the men who had come to kill the child fell to their knees, their darkest deeds spilling out of them like water from a broken dam. Shady just smiled, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering torchlight, absorbing their shame as if it were the very air he breathed. The pressure in the village was reaching a breaking point. The air tasted of copper and cold smoke. Ifeoma knew that the time for hiding was over. She could not feel the child's weight increasing, not just from physical growth, but from the spiritual burden he was carrying. Every secret he unearthed was a brick added to his foundation. She looked down at him and saw a flicker of profound sadness in his dark eyes. He didn't want to kill them. He wanted to be heard. He wanted the story of his first life to be told so that his second life could truly begin. He was a mirror, and the village couldn't stand what they saw reflected in him. Ifeoma gathered the remaining survivors in the village square. It was a pathetic assembly, men and women broken by fear, their eyes darting to the shadow, waiting for the ground to open up and swallow them. She stood on the ancestral stone, holding Shady against her chest. She saw the faces of the people she had known her whole life, people who had shared in the secrets of the forest, people who had grown fat on the crops of the farming years while a nameless child rotted in the underground. She could have stayed silent. She could have fled into the night and tried to raise this ghost child in the safety of another land. But she knew the haunting word would follow her. The death was not hers alone. It belonged to the soil itself. With a voice that shook but did not break, Ifeoma began to speak. She told them everything. She spoke of the night in the forest, the rusted blade, and the way the elders had prayed while the child bled. She described the way they had all agreed to never speak of it again, convinced that their silence was the price of their prosperity. She confessed her own parts, the way she had held the light so that the killers could see what they were doing. As she spoke, the wind began to howl, wiping through the village square and carrying the scent of a damp earth and ancient leaf. The villagers fell to their knees, some weeping, some staring in horrified silence as the weight of their collective sin was finally dragged into the lights of the torches. And then the silence was broken. From the bundle in Ifeoma's arms, a sound emerged. It wasn't the soft, rhythmic cry of a newborn. It was a harrowing, multi-layered wail, the sound of 100 voices crying out at once. It was the sound of the wind, the sound of the rain, and the sound of every soul that had ever been forgotten or discarded by the greed of men. The cry was so loud it seemed to shake the very foundation of the huts, vibrating through the bones of everyone present. Ifeoma held him tighter, weeping with him, feeling the coldness leaves his skin and the unnatural stillness evaporates. She wasn't just holding a spirit anymore, she was holding a grief that had finally been allowed to speak its name. By the time the first ray of the morning sun touched the village, the crying had stopped. The wind died down, leaving a silence that felt clean for the first time in 12 years. Ifeoma looked down, expecting to see her son asleep, but the cloth in her arm was empty. There was no sign that a child had ever been there, save for a small, wet patch where his tears had fallen on her wrap. The death stopped that day. The village was left in a state of perpetual mourning, but the air was finally clear. They buried the artifact he had found, creating a shrine in the forest to the child they had killed, and they gave him a name, Omekanaya, the one who does like his father. Though in this case, his father was justice itself. From that day forward, an ancestral law was etched into the heart of the community. No child would ever be born in secrecy, and every birth would be a public celebration of life. For the village had learned that a secret kept is a ghost invited. But the haunting did not entirely vanish. On the night when the moon is hidden and the trees whispered to one another in the language of the dead, the villagers still hear it, a faint, distant crying coming from the deep forest. It is a reminder that the earth never forgets what is buried within it, and that the silence of the past will always, eventually, find a voice. Sometimes, when a new mother in the village holds her child for the first time, and the baby lets out that first sharp wail, the elders smile. They know that as long as the children cry, the land is at peace. But if ever a child is born who smiles when he should weep, they know that somewhere a truth is still waiting to be told. This is the whispers of the forbidden, where some things are not meant to be told, but they are told. And I remain Jesse, your narrator.